I wasn't supposed to be in Copper Creek Valley that October morning in 1878. I was supposed to be in Abilene, Kansas, pretending Edmund Voss hadn't humiliated me in front of 40 people at the Grand Hotel the week before. But God works in mysterious ways, my mother always said. And that morning, standing in front of a ranch house I'd never seen, about to meet a man I'd never heard of until his telegram arrived, I started to believe her. The telegram had been short. Housekeeper needed. Medical training required. Isolated ranch. Hard work. Fair wages. Come immediately if able. J.T. McAllister, Copper Creek, Montana Territory. What it didn't say was this. The man was desperate. The man was drowning. The man needed saving. And I was about to become his only lifeline. My mother sat beside me on the wagon bench, hands folded in her lap, watching the road unroll ahead of us, with the patience of a woman who had spent 52 years learning that hurrying changed nothing. Helen Thornfield had buried a husband at Little Bighorn, raised a daughter alone in mining camps and cavalry forts, and developed the particular wisdom of women who survive by seeing 3 moves ahead of everyone else. She hadn't said much since we'd crossed into Montana Territory 2 days ago, just watched the landscape change from flat Kansas plains to rolling hills to these mountains that rose up like the very bones of the earth, pushing through skin. The ranch came into view around a bend in the road, and I pulled the mule to a slow walk. Not because I was afraid. I'd stopped being afraid of new places when I realized every place judged you the same, but because I needed to see it before it saw me. A place built by a man who trusted nothing but his own hands. Low and gray, built into the hillside like it was trying to hide. Practical, defensible. Split-rail fences ran in clean lines across pasture land. A barn stood to the east, solid construction, good timber. Cattle grazed in the distance, maybe 40 head, healthy-looking from what I could see. It was the kind of place a man spent years building, the kind of place worth fighting for. Then I saw him. Jonas Tate McAllister stood on the porch of that gray house, and even at a distance I could read the posture of a man carrying weight he hadn't asked for. He was tall, well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered in the way of men who'd spent their lives doing hard physical work, dark hair, weathered face, and something in the way he stood that reminded me of cavalry officers I'd known. The ones who'd seen too much and learned to keep it locked down tight. He was holding a piece of paper in his hand, an official-looking document, and as I watched, he bowed his head. His lips moved. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew what I was seeing. I'd seen it before in field hospitals when men prayed over wounded friends, when mothers prayed over dying sons. Jonas McAllister was praying. A rider appeared from the direction of town, approaching at a steady trot. The man dismounted, handed McAllister a second document, and rode off without staying for conversation. McAllister read the new paper. His face, already grave, went harder, stone, hard. I heard him speak, though he was talking to no one but himself and the empty Montana sky. 30 days. Lord, I've got 30 days. My mother touched my arm. The wagon had stopped without me realizing it. I'd been so focused on the man on the porch that I'd forgotten I was supposed to be arriving, not observing. Go on, daughter, Helen said quietly. He's been waiting for an answer. Let's not make him wait longer. I clucked to the mule and the wagon rolled forward, wheels crunching on the dirt road. McAllister looked up from his prayer. He saw the wagon approaching, and I watched something move across his face. Not quite relief, not quite hope, something closer to wonder. A man who'd asked for help, and help actually came. I climbed down from the wagon, which took a moment because the step was high and I am not a small woman, and I have never apologized for that fact and wasn't about to start now. My mother followed, moving with the quiet efficiency she brought to everything. McAllister came down from the porch, removing his hat as he approached. Up close, I could see the gray in his dark hair, the lines around his eyes, the scar across his knuckles. The eyes themselves were gray, the color of Montana winter sky, and they looked at me with the directness of a man who'd spent years reading people for a living. Mrs. Thornfield, he said, addressing my mother. Miss, I corrected. Nora Agnes Thornfield. This is my mother, Helen. He looked at me then. Really looked. Not the quick dismissive glance men often gave me when they realized my size. Not the second look that came after, the one that tried to reconcile what they were seeing with what they thought a woman should be. Just a clear, assessing look that seemed to be measuring something other than height or weight. You came, he said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite name. Your telegram said immediately, I replied. I take instructions seriously. No, I mean, he stopped, started again. I prayed this morning, asked God to send help before the bank takes everything, and here you are. I looked at him carefully. Jonas McAllister didn't strike me as a man given to flights of fancy or religious fervor. He struck me as practical, grounded, someone who built with his hands and trusted what he could see and touch. For him to speak of prayer so plainly meant he was desperate indeed. Well, I said, I can't speak to divine intervention, Mr. McAllister, but I can speak to housekeeping and medical training and hard work. If that's the help you need, I'm here to provide it. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his mouth. It suits me fine, Miss Thornfield. Come on up to the house. I'll show you around, and we can discuss terms. The house was as practical inside as it was outside. Clean, sparse, functional. A main room with a stone fireplace. A kitchen that showed signs of a man cooking for himself without much enthusiasm. 2 bedrooms. A loft space. The furniture was handmade, but well crafted. The floors were swept. The windows let in good light. It was the home of a man who'd built something with care and was trying his best to maintain it alone. My mother went to inspect the kitchen with the focused attention she brought to all domestic spaces, running her fingers along surfaces, opening cupboards, checking the stove. I'd learned long ago that Helen Thornfield could read a kitchen the way I could read a patient's symptoms. She was gathering information, making assessments, deciding what needed fixing. McAllister laid the 2 documents on the rough-hewn table. Bank foreclosure notice, he said, pointing to the first. 30 days to pay $800 or lose the ranch. That's a substantial sum, I said. I've got the cattle contract due to pay out in 6 weeks. Should cover 2/3 of it. The rest. He stopped. The rest I was counting on having time to arrange. And this? I pointed to the second document. County survey order. Judge Warren Howell has ordered a review of my east boundary. Says there are questions about the original survey from 1871. I picked up the paper and read it with the attention to detail I'd learned in 3 years of reading Army medical reports and supply contracts. The devil was always in the details. The lies were always buried in the language. This survey order is dated 3 days after the bank sent the foreclosure notice, I said. That's not coincidence. Someone coordinated this. McAllister stared at me. How do you know that? I was a field medic at Fort Laramie. And Fort Reno, I said, 1873 to 76. When soldiers died, officers tried to blame natural causes to avoid accountability. I learned to read documents for what they don't say as much as what they do say. And this document doesn't say why the boundary is being questioned. It doesn't cite specific irregularities. It just says, review is needed. I set the paper down and looked at him directly. Someone wants your land, Mr. McAllister, and they're using the law as a weapon to take it. The survey creates a title question. The bank uses that as grounds to call your loan early. You can't pay, you lose everything. It goes to auction, and whoever has been planning this buys it for pennies on the dollar. McAllister pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, like a man who'd been standing too long under a weight he could barely carry. Judge Howell ruled against my neighbor Patterson last year, he said. Boundary dispute. Patterson lost his western parcel, sold at auction to pay legal fees. A company bought it, something called Meridian Land Holdings, registered out of Helena. He rubbed his face with both hands. I thought it was bad luck. Thought Patterson had gotten careless with his paperwork. But if you're saying this is deliberate, it's a pattern, I said. And patterns don't happen by accident. My mother returned from the kitchen. The stovepipe needs cleaning, she said without preamble. You've got mice in the pantry. The flour bin hasn't been scrubbed since spring. And you've been living on salt pork and hardtack for long enough that you're probably deficient in half a dozen essential nutrients. She looked at McAllister with the frank assessment of a woman who'd nursed hundreds of soldiers and had no patience for masculine pride getting in the way of practical care. You need more than a housekeeper, Mr. McAllister. You need someone to keep you alive while you fight whatever fight is coming. Can you afford us both? The terms in the telegram, he said, were $8 a month for the housekeeper. I can add 6 for your mother if the work holds. 10, I said. He looked at me. 8 is fair. 10 is necessary. You've had no help since spring at minimum. You're behind on every piece of work that requires 2 people. I'm the second person. And I'm also the person who just told you what you're actually fighting. Information like that is worth more than $8. The silence stretched. I could see him thinking, weighing, calculating, not just the money, but what it meant to let strangers into his struggle, to trust people he'd known for less than an hour with problems that could cost him everything. 10, he said finally, if the work holds. It'll hold, I replied. My mother and I unpacked our belongings in the room McAllister showed us. It was small but clean, with a window looking east toward the mountains. 2 beds, a dresser, hooks for clothes, a room that said temporary occupants, not family. But I'd lived in temporary spaces most of my life. This was better than most. I was putting my medical bag in the dresser when I noticed the floorboards near the bed didn't sit quite flush, not warped or damaged, or just slightly raised, as if something underneath was pushing up. Curiosity was one of my defining characteristics. It had gotten me in trouble more times than I could count. It had also saved lives, uncovered corruption, and led me to truths that others missed because they weren't looking. I knelt down and worked my fingers under the board. It lifted easily, too easily. This wasn't accidental displacement. This was a hiding place. Inside was a leather-bound journal, small enough to fit in a pocket, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The leather was good quality, expensive. Not the kind of thing a rancher would buy for himself. I lifted it out carefully, opened it. The handwriting was feminine, neat, educated, the script of someone who'd had schooling and practice. The first entry was dated October 12th, 1877. JT doesn't know I've been keeping records, but I've seen Judge Howell ride past our boundary too many times to be coincidence. He's measuring, planning. I need to tell JT, but he'll say I'm worrying over nothing. If anything happens to me, whoever finds this, Judge Howell wants this land. Don't let him take it. Sarah Elizabeth Brennan. My heart started beating faster. I turned the page. November 3rd, 1877. I'm with child. JT will be a wonderful father. If it's a girl, we'll name her Nora, after my grandmother who stood up to land grabbers in Missouri. If it's a boy, Thomas, after my uncle who died fighting for workers' rights. S.E.B. I looked at that name. Nora. The same name as mine. A grandmother who stood up to land grabbers. I turned to the last entry. The handwriting was shakier, less controlled. December 18th, 1877. Baby coming too early. Something's wrong. JT is in town getting supplies. If I don't survive. Howell was here yesterday. He told me JT's Pinkerton past was coming back to haunt him. He smiled when he said it. He knew something. Please, whoever reads this, protect JT. Sarah. I heard footsteps in the hall, heavy boots. I shoved the journal back under the floorboard and replaced the board, just as McAllister appeared in the doorway. That was Sarah's room, he said quietly. My wife. She died last December. Childbirth. The baby? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Died with her. Too early. Too small. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. He leaned against the doorframe, looking at the room but not really seeing it. I should have told you before you came. Some folks in town say the place is cursed. I don't believe in curses. But I believe in consequences. I was gone when she needed me. Was in town buying supplies for winter. Thought I had time. By the time I got back..." He stopped, cleared his throat. "Anyway, you should know, in case it changes things." "It doesn't change things," I said. He nodded once and left. I waited until his footsteps faded. Then I pulled the journal back out and read it again, slowly, carefully, looking for everything Sarah Elizabeth Brennan had tried to tell whoever found her words. Judge Howell had been watching this ranch. Sarah had known it. She'd been afraid enough to keep a secret record. And she'd died the day after Howell visited and threatened her husband. I thought about premature labor, about stress and fear and the ways the body responds to trauma. I thought about a pregnant woman alone, confronted by a man who smiled while delivering threats. Medical records would say she died in childbirth, natural causes. Tragic but not uncommon on the frontier. But I'd spent 3 years documenting the difference between what records said and what actually happened. Sarah Elizabeth Brennan hadn't just died. She'd been killed, not with a weapon, with fear. And the man who'd killed her was the same man trying to steal her husband's land. I closed the journal and wrapped it back in the oilcloth, put it in my medical bag this time, not under the floor. This wasn't just a historical document. This was evidence, and I intended to use it. Supper that first night was venison stew that my mother made from supplies she'd found in the pantry, supplemented with vegetables she'd brought in our stores. McAllister ate like a man who'd forgotten what real cooking tasted like. He didn't speak for the first 10 minutes, just ate steadily, methodically, the way soldiers ate when they'd learned not to waste time on conversation during meals. Finally, he set down his spoon and looked at my mother. "This is the best meal I've had in a year, Mrs. Thornfield." "Helen," she corrected, "and you're welcome." "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked. "Cavalry camps," she said. "Followed my husband from post to post for 15 years. When you're feeding officers and enlisted men and trying to make army rations into something edible, you learn efficiency. Your husband was cavalry?" "Captain James Thornfield, 7th Cavalry. He died at Little Bighorn." McAllister's face changed. "I'm sorry." That was..." He stopped. "That was a hard day for a lot of families." "It was," Helen agreed. She didn't elaborate. Helen never elaborated on her grief. She just carried it quietly and kept moving forward. There was a moment of silence. Then McAllister turned to me. "Your telegram mentioned medical training." "Fort Laramie and Fort Reno," I said. "Field medic. I worked in the infirmary and with the post surgeon. Treated everything from gunshot wounds to cholera to broken bones. That's unusual training for a woman." "The Army didn't care about unusual when they were short-staffed and men were dying," I said. "They cared about competence." "I was competent." "Why did you leave?" I set down my fork, met his eyes directly. "I reported a superior officer for covering up equipment failure that killed 3 soldiers. The officer was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pierce. His brother-in-law supplied the equipment. His other brother-in-law was the garrison commander. I documented everything, submitted it through proper channels. And they discharged you," McAllister said. It wasn't a question. "They gave me a choice. Retract the documentation and sign a statement saying I'd been mistaken due to emotional distress, or accept a medical discharge for nervous condition." I held his gaze. I didn't retract it. "What happened to the lieutenant colonel?" 1 year later, a different officer reviewed the file. Pierce was court-martialed, reduced in rank, discharged. McAllister nodded slowly. "So you won." "The 3 soldiers were still dead," I said, "but the record was straight. That's all I could do." Something shifted in McAllister's expression, a kind of recognition, like he was seeing something in me that he understood from his own experience. "I was Pinkerton," he said, 1867 to 71. Tracked fugitives, recovered stolen property, investigated crimes. I was good at it, too good." He pushed his plate away, appetite apparently gone. 1871, they sent me after a man named Thomas Brennan. Labor organizer. Railroad company said he was inciting violence, sabotaging equipment, threatening workers. They wanted him brought in. I found him in a mining camp in Idaho Territory. He didn't resist, came along peacefully, said he wanted his day in court to prove the railroad was lying. I brought him to Wyoming. They hanged him 3 days later. McAllister's hands clenched on the table. Turned out he wasn't inciting violence. He was organizing for safety regulations. Men were dying from faulty equipment, and the railroad was covering it up. Brennan had documentation, evidence. They killed him before it could come to trial. What did you do? I asked. I quit, came to Montana, built this place with my own hands, something clean, something I could make without blood on it. He looked at me directly. Then I met Sarah. She was Thomas Brennan's niece. The room went very quiet. She knew who you were? My mother asked. She knew, McAllister confirmed. I told her straight out. Figured she'd spit in my face. Instead, she said her uncle would have wanted me to do something good with the guilt. Said the best way to honor him was to build something worth building and live honest. He smiled, but it was the saddest smile I'd ever seen. We got married, started building a life. And for 6 years, I thought maybe I'd gotten it right. Maybe I'd made something clean after all. Then Sarah died, I said quietly. Then Sarah died, he repeated. And now someone's trying to take the only clean thing I ever built. Judge Howell, I said. He was at your wedding. McAllister's head snapped up. How did you know that? Tell me about Howell and Sarah, I said instead of answering. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he sighed. Howell courted Sarah before I came to Montana. She refused him. Said he was too controlling, too ambitious, too focused on building power, instead of building anything real. When she chose me instead, he didn't take it well, I finished. No, he gave a toast at our wedding, said he wished us all the happiness we deserved. At the time, I thought he was being gracious. Looking back, it sounds like a threat, I said. McAllister stood abruptly, walked to the window, looked out at the darkening Montana sky. You're saying Howell has been planning this for years. Since the wedding, I'm saying a rejected suitor who happens to be a judge has the means, motive, and opportunity to destroy you, and Sarah knew it. She saw him watching this place. She was afraid enough to... I stopped. I'd almost mentioned the journal, but some instinct told me to wait, to gather more information before I showed him what his dead wife had left behind. Afraid enough to what? McAllister turned back to me. Afraid enough to worry, I said, to see patterns, to know something was wrong. The next morning, I woke before dawn. Old habit from army life. My mother was already in the kitchen, starting coffee, moving quietly so as not to wake McAllister. He's a good man, she said without preamble when I entered. Carries his guilt like a stone, but good underneath. You got all that from one supper conversation? I asked. I got it from watching him pray when he thought no one could see, Helen said. Desperate men pray 2 ways. They pray for escape, or they pray for strength to do what's right. He was praying the second way. She handed me coffee. You found something in that room yesterday. I saw your face when he came to the door. I pulled out Sarah's journal, showed my mother. She read it in silence, her face growing graver with each page. This is evidence of intent, she said finally. If Howell threatened Sarah, and she went into premature labor the next day. It's not legally murder, I said, but morally? He killed her as surely as if he'd pulled a trigger. Does Jonas know? Not yet. Why not? Because I need to understand the full scope of what we're fighting before I show him the worst of it, I said. If I tell him now, he'll ride into town and confront Howell. He'll get himself arrested or killed. We need strategy, not rage. My mother smiled. That's my daughter, always thinking 3 moves ahead. I learned from the best, I replied. After breakfast, McAllister took me to see the east boundary. We rode out on 2 of his horses, sturdy mountain-bred animals that knew the terrain. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of Montana autumn day that makes you understand why people fight to stay in this hard country. The cottonwood tree stood at the boundary like a sentinel, massive, ancient, its trunk easily 5 feet across. Carved into the bark, still visible despite years of growth, were the words, McAllister Boundary, 1871, Surveyor J. Pruitt. That's the primary marker. McAllister said. Surveyor Pruitt used this tree because it was already over 100 years old in 71. Figured it would outlast any boundary dispute. And this? I pointed to the stone cairn nearby, 12 rocks stacked carefully, topped with a distinctive flat stone streaked with white quartz. Secondary marker. Pruitt placed it here, then had it confirmed by Gerald Collier in 74. Both markers together established the boundary as legally fixed. I dismounted and walked around the cairn, examining the ground. My medical training had taught me to observe details others missed. The disturbed earth, the slight discoloration, the things that didn't quite fit the natural landscape. Someone's been here recently, I said. Look at these boot prints. And here the ground's been disturbed. Someone was testing whether they could move the cairn without being noticed. McAllister knelt beside me, studying the evidence. His face hardened. There, I pointed. Fresh surveyor stakes, 40 feet west of the cairn. Someone's trying to move the boundary. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. Bark exploded from the cottonwood 6 inches above my head. McAllister grabbed my arm and pulled me down behind the cairn as 2 more shots rang out. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, silhouetted against the morning sun. The lead rider, a heavy-set man with a red beard, shouted across the distance. McAllister, Judge Howell says quit harassing his surveyors. You got questions about the boundary, you take them to court. Next time we won't aim high. They wheeled their horses and rode off, disappearing back into the trees. I crouched behind the stone cairn, my heart pounding, and felt something I hadn't felt since Fort Reno, the cold clarity that came with danger, the sharpening of senses, the absolute focus. That was Clyde Marsh, McAllister said, his voice tight with controlled anger. He and his brothers work for Howell. They're also the ones who convinced my ranch hands to quit last spring. Showed up, made threats, said anyone working for me was going to be on the wrong side of the law soon. This is beyond legal maneuvering, I said. This is intimidation, this is violence. I know, and you've been fighting this alone. I didn't want to drag anyone else into it, McAllister said. Didn't seem right. I stood up, brushing dirt from my skirt, and looked at him directly. Mr. McAllister, I need to show you something, and when I do, you need to promise me you won't ride into town and do something that gets you killed. What are you talking about? Promise first. He studied my face. Whatever he saw there made him nod. I promise. I pulled out Sarah's journal and handed it to him. I watched Jonas McAllister read his dead wife's words, watched his face change as he understood what she'd known, what she'd feared, what she'd tried to protect him from. Watched him reach the last entry, dated the day before she died. His hands started shaking. She knew, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She knew Howell was coming for me, and I didn't protect her. You couldn't have known, I started. I should have. He stood abruptly, the journal clenched in his fist. I'm trained to see these things. I spent 4 years as a Pinkerton learning to read people, spot threats. And I was so busy building this place, proving I could make something good, that I missed what was happening right in front of me. His voice broke. She died because I wasn't paying attention. She died because Howell came here and threatened me, and she was alone and afraid, and he couldn't finish. Just stood there, this big, strong man who'd built a ranch with his hands and survived the Pinkerton service and fought off land grabbers, stood there shaking with grief and guilt. I did something then that surprised both of us. I put my hand on his shoulder. Listen to me, I said firmly. Sarah died because Warren Howell is a cruel man who uses fear as a weapon. She died because bringing life into this world is dangerous even under the best circumstances. She died because sometimes terrible things happen and there's nothing anyone could have done to stop them. I made him look at me. But she left you, this journal. She left you warning. She left you a way to fight back, and if you waste that by getting yourself killed in some reckless confrontation, then her death means nothing. Do you understand? He took a shaking breath, then another, the control slowly coming back. What do I do? He asked. We finish what Sarah started, I said. We protect this place. We stop Howell. We do it smart, and we do it legal, and we make sure that when it's done, the record is straight. Just like you did at Fort Reno. Just like I did at Fort Reno, I confirmed. We rode back to the ranch in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than the ride out. Not the silence of strangers, but the silence of people who'd seen each other's worst fears and were still standing. When we reached the house, we found an old man waiting on the porch. He was thin, gray-haired, trembling slightly, but his eyes were clear and determined. "Mr. McAllister," he said, "I need to tell you something before I lose my nerve." "Gerald Collier," McAllister said, surprised. "You should be resting. Doc Pierce said your lungs—" "That's why I'm here," Collier interrupted. He pulled out a leather document case. Inside were survey documents, carefully preserved, dated 1874. I verified your boundary markers 4 years after the original survey. Everything was correct, properly placed, legally binding. I recorded it all official-like. He handed the documents to McAllister. 3 weeks ago, Judge Howell came to see me. Said there were irregularities in my 74 survey. Threatened to revoke my certification, which would cost me my pension. He wanted me to say the markers were misplaced, that the boundary was uncertain. Collier's hands tightened on the document case. "I'm dying, Mr. McAllister. Lung disease. Doctor says 6 months, maybe less, and I decided I'd rather die honest than live as a coward. So here's your proof. Everything documented. Everything legal. You use this to stop that son of a—" He stopped himself, glanced at me. "Pardon my language, miss." "No pardon needed," I said. "I've heard worse in army camps." Collier nodded and turned back to McAllister. "One more thing. Howell's doing this to other folks, too. Patterson Ranch wasn't the first. There's a pattern going back at least 5 years, always the same. Boundary dispute, legal fees, foreclosure, auction, and always the same company buying at auction." "What company?" I asked sharply. "Meridian Land Holdings," Collier said. "Registered in Helena. I looked into it when Patterson lost his place. Couldn't find much, but I found enough to know it's connected to Howell somehow." He handed me a piece of paper with an address. "Territorial Land Office in Helena. Keeps the incorporation records. You want to know who really owns Meridian? That's where you look." After Collier left, I spread all the documents across the kitchen table. Sarah's journal, Collier's 1874 survey confirmation, the bank foreclosure notice, the county survey order, the scrap of paper with the Helena address. I sat down and began to read through everything systematically, the way I'd read through medical records at Fort Reno, looking for connections, patterns, the things that didn't quite fit. McAllister and my mother watched me work in silence. After an hour, I looked up. "This isn't about your land specifically," I said. "This is about a systematic land theft operation that's been running for at least 5 years. Howell picks targets, isolated ranchers usually. He manufactures boundary disputes using his authority as judge, forces them into expensive legal fights. When they can't pay, the properties go to auction. Meridian Land Holdings buys them cheap. And Meridian is Howell's company," McAllister said. "I think so. But we need proof. We need to know who actually owns Meridian. That's in Helena." 3-day ride, my mother said quietly. "In weather that could turn any moment," McAllister added. "And if Howell catches word we're looking into his business, he'll escalate," I finished, "which means we don't have much time." I looked at the foreclosure notice. 29 days now. We need to move fast. We need to be smart. And we need to be ready for Howell to fight back. That night, I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about Sarah's journal, about the woman who'd died trying to protect her husband, about the child who'd never been born, who would have been named Nora if she'd been a girl. I got up and went to the kitchen for water, found Jonas McAllister already there, sitting at the table in the dark. "Can't sleep either?" I asked. He shook his head. "Keep thinking about what Collier said, that there's a pattern, that I'm not the first." "You're not," I confirmed, "but you might be the last. If we can prove Howell's connection to Meridian, if we can show systematic fraud, it won't just save your ranch. It'll stop him from doing this to anyone else." "Why do you care so much?" McAllister asked. "You could leave, take your wages, find easier work somewhere safer." I sat down across from him. I told you about Fort Reno, about the soldiers who died, but I didn't tell you the whole truth. I paused, gathering the words. After I was discharged, I went back to Kansas, tried to find normal work, tried to pretend the fight was over, and I watched corrupt men keep being corrupt because no one would stand up to them. I watched good people suffer because standing up seemed too hard, too dangerous. I met his eyes in the darkness. I'm done watching, I'm done running, and I'm done letting men like Howell think they can destroy good people just because they have power. We sat in silence for a moment. Then McAllister said quietly, "Thank you." For what? For seeing this fight. For standing in it. For... He stopped. For making me feel less alone. Something shifted in the air between us. Not romantic. Not yet. But something deeper. The recognition of kindred spirits. Of people who'd both learned hard lessons about justice and were willing to pay the price to see it done. "Get some sleep," I said finally. "Tomorrow we start planning. Really planning. How to get to Helena, what to look for, how to protect ourselves while we're gone." McAllister stood, nodded, turned to go. Then he stopped at the doorway and looked back. "Sarah would have liked you," he said. "You remind me of her. The steel underneath. The refusal to back down." He left before I could respond. I sat alone in the dark kitchen and thought about a woman I'd never met. A woman who'd been brave enough to document the truth even when she knew it was dangerous. A woman who'd wanted to name her daughter Nora. And I made a promise to Sarah Elizabeth Brennan McAllister. I promise I'll finish what you started. I promise I'll protect him. And I promise that Warren Howell will pay for what he did to you. The journal was still in my medical bag. I took it out one more time and read the last entry by lamplight. "Please, whoever reads this, protect JT." "I will," I whispered to the empty room. "I will." Outside, the Montana night pressed close around the ranch. Stars burned cold and distant overhead, and somewhere in town, Warren Howell was planning his next move. But so was I. And he had no idea that the big woman from Kansas was about to become his worst nightmare. Morning came cold and sharp, the kind of October dawn that warned winter was coming, whether Montana was ready or not. I woke to the sound of my mother moving in the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of coffee being made, wood being fed to the stove, the quiet efficiency of a woman who'd spent decades making homes in temporary places. I dressed quickly and joined her. Helen handed me a cup of coffee without speaking, but her eyes asked the question. "We're going to town today," I said. "All three of us. Jonas needs supplies. I need to look at county records, and we need to be seen. If Howell thinks we're hiding, he'll know we're afraid. If we walk through town like we have every right to be there, it changes the dynamic." My mother nodded slowly. "You're using the same strategy the officers used at Little Bighorn. Make them think you're stronger than you are." "I'm not pretending to be stronger," I said. "I'm just refusing to act weaker." Jonas emerged from his room, already dressed for the day. He moved like a man who'd made a decision during the night, shoulders back, jaw set. The grief was still there in his eyes when he looked at me, but so was something else. Purpose. "We're going to Copper Creek," he said. It wasn't a question. "We are," I confirmed. "You need supplies. I need to see the land office records. And we need to let Howell know he hasn't scared us off. He'll see it as a challenge," Jonas said. "Good. Let him. Men like Howell are used to people backing down. When someone doesn't, it throws off their timing." "You learned that at Fort Reno, too?" he asked. "I learned that from being 6 feet tall in a world that thinks women should be small and quiet," I replied. "Every day of my life has been practice in not backing down." The ride into Copper Creek took just over an hour. The town came into view gradually, emerging from the valley like something that had grown there naturally rather than been built. Main Street ran north to south, flanked by the standard frontier buildings. General store, bank, land office, courthouse that doubled as a saloon, boarding house, church, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business before they finished having it. I could feel eyes on us as we rode in. Not hostile exactly, but assessing. A stranger was always notable in a small town. A woman my size was unforgettable. Jonas pulled the wagon up in front of the general store. "I'll get the supplies," he said. "You know what you're looking for at the land office?" "Original survey records," I said. 1871 filing by Surveyor Pruitt. I want to see what the official documentation says versus what Howell's new survey is claiming. The land office was a single room, neat and organized, run by a young clerk who looked up when I entered and did the thing people always did. The quick glance, the double take, the recalibration of expectations. I was used to it. I didn't let it slow me down. "I need to review the survey records for the McAllister property," I said. "Eastern boundary filed 1871. The clerk blinked. "You'd need authorization from the property owner for that, ma'am." I slid a paper across the counter. Jonas had signed it that morning, authorizing me to review all documents related to his property. The clerk read it, looked at me again, this time with something closer to respect. "Give me a few minutes," he said. While he searched the records, I studied the office itself. Maps on the walls showing the county divided into parcels, filing cabinets organized by year and district, a desk with neat stacks of paperwork waiting to be processed, and there, partially visible under a stack of official forms, a letter with the Meridian Land Holdings letterhead. I couldn't read the full text from where I stood, but I could see the signature. Warren T. Howell, legal representative. The clerk returned with a large ledger. "Here's the 1871 survey record," he said. "You can review it at that table there." I sat down and opened the ledger carefully. Surveyor Pruitt's handwriting was precise, technical, the writing of a man who knew his documentation might be challenged someday and wanted everything clear. "Eastern boundary of McAllister property," he'd written, "established by primary marker at Cottonwood Tree, approximately 120 years growth, marked with surveyor's notation and date. Secondary marker placed 40 feet south, stone cairn of 12 rocks, topped with distinctive quartz-streaked capstone, bearing from Cottonwood to cairn, 187 degrees. Distance, 40 feet, 2 inches. I copied the information into my notebook, word for word. Then I asked the clerk a question. "Has anyone else reviewed this record recently?" He hesitated. "Judge Howell requested it about 2 months ago," he said. "Said he needed to verify some details for a legal matter. Did he make copies?" The clerk's discomfort increased. "I'm not supposed to discuss that, ma'am." "I understand," I said. "You're trying to do your job properly, I respect that. But if someone has been altering official records, that's not a legal matter. That's fraud. And when fraud gets exposed, the people who helped cover it up tend to suffer alongside the people who committed it." I let that sink in. "I'm not asking you to betray confidence. I'm asking you to think about whether you want to be part of what's coming when this all falls apart." The clerk swallowed hard. "He made copies," he admitted quietly. "And he asked me to note any discrepancies I found between the original survey and the current boundary markers. Did you find discrepancies?" "No, ma'am. The markers are exactly where Surveyor Pruitt said they'd be. I wrote out myself to check. Everything matches." "Then why is Judge Howell ordering a new survey?" The clerk looked at me directly. "You'd have to ask him that, ma'am. But between you and me, I don't think it's about accuracy." I thanked him and left, carrying the weight of that confirmation. The original survey was accurate. The boundary was clear. Howell knew it. And he was proceeding anyway. This wasn't about correcting errors. This was about creating them. Outside, I found Jonas loading supplies into the wagon. My mother stood nearby, and I noticed she was engaged in conversation with another woman. Older, well-dressed, someone who carried herself with the authority of social position. The woman turned as I approached, and I saw her eyes do the assessment. Quick, comprehensive, judgmental. She had the look of someone who'd been the arbiter of propriety in this town for long enough to consider it her personal domain. "You must be the new help at the McAllister place," she said. The warmth in her voice was practiced, professional, a verbal weapon women had perfected over generations. "I'm Nora Thornfield," I said, "Mr. McAllister's housekeeper." "Adelaide Marsh," the woman replied. "My husband runs the bank." She said it the way people name landmarks, so you understand the geography, so you know where power lives. Mrs. Marsh, I said with a nod. Well, she continued, I'm sure you'll be very comfortable out at the ranch. It must be such a relief, having a settled position, given your circumstances. The pause before circumstances was deliberate, calculated, the kind of verbal weapon women had been using on each other since language began. I'd been on the receiving end of this particular attack my entire life, the implication that my size, my unmarried state, my need to work for wages, somehow made me fortunate to be employed at all, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity came my way. I was tired of it. Marsh, I said, my voice pleasant and absolutely clear. I came into town this morning to review land office records, confirm survey documentation that's going to matter considerably in the next few weeks, and gather information about property fraud that appears to be systematic in this county. I held her gaze. Those are my circumstances. Is there anything else you wanted to know? Adelaide Marsh's smile didn't break. It was structural, load-bearing, the kind that had been holding up her social position for decades. But something behind it shifted. The temperature changed. My goodness, she said softly. Good day, Mrs. Marsh, I said, and moved past her to the wagon. I heard Jonas behind me, approaching from the general store. He stopped a few feet away. I could tell from the quality of the silence that he'd heard at least part of the exchange. Adelaide, he said. His voice was courteous and absolutely flat. Jonas, she replied. The warmth dialed up slightly. We were just getting acquainted. I see that, he said. He moved to the wagon and checked the supplies, without looking at Adelaide again. The dismissal was so complete and so quiet that Adelaide had two choices: make something of it in the street in front of witnesses, or absorb it. She absorbed it, said something pleasant about the weather, and walked back toward the bank with careful dignity. You didn't need to do that, I said to Jonas as we climbed onto the wagon. No, he agreed, but I wanted to. Something passed between us, not words, just understanding. We were halfway down Main Street when I saw him, Judge Warren Howell, standing outside the courthouse, watching us with the focused attention of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. He was tall, silver-haired, well-dressed, someone who looked like authority incarnate, who'd probably been told since childhood that he was destined for important things and had built his entire identity around that destiny. He stepped into the street, forcing Jonas to slow the wagon. Mr. McAllister, he said. The voice was smooth, practiced. And Miss Thornfield, I've been hearing about you. Judge Howell, I said. His eyes moved over me with the kind of assessment that tried to reduce a person to their weaknesses, looking for the vulnerability, the pressure point. I looked back with the steady regard I'd learned in army hospitals, the look that said I'd seen men die and deliver life and everything in between, and nothing you show me will make me flinch. I understand you've been asking questions at the land office, Howell said, about surveys and boundaries. Public records, I replied, available to anyone. Of course, though I wonder why a housekeeper needs to concern herself with legal matters. And I wonder why a judge would order a new survey when the original 1871 documentation is perfectly clear, I said, when Gerald Collier verified every marker in 1874, when the county's own records show no discrepancies whatsoever. Howell's smile tightened fractionally. Routine review, he said. Due diligence. Surely you understand the importance of making sure everything is in order. Oh, I understand due diligence, I said. I also understand systematic fraud. I spent 3 years at Fort Reno, documenting how corrupt officers used paperwork as a weapon. The methodology is always the same. Create confusion, manufacture discrepancies, use legal procedure to steal what you can't take by force. The street around us had gone quiet. People were watching now. This wasn't a private conversation anymore. It was a public challenge. Howell's face changed. The practiced warmth dropped away, revealing something harder underneath. Miss Thornfield, he said, and the courtesy title sounded like an insult. You're new here. You don't understand the history. You don't understand what Mr. McAllister is. Then enlighten me, I said. Howell turned to look at Jonas directly. 12 years ago, Jonas McAllister was a Pinkerton detective. He tracked my brother, Thomas Brennan, for alleged crimes against a railroad company. My brother was a labor organizer. He was fighting for worker safety, and McAllister brought him in to be hanged. The street was absolutely silent now. Then, Howell continued, his voice rising, McAllister had the audacity to marry my niece, Sarah, the woman I loved, the woman who should have been my wife. His control was cracking now, the careful judge persona fracturing. So yes, Miss Thornfield, I want his land. I want everything he built with the blood money from my brother's death. You call it fraud, I call it justice. The performance was impressive. The grief in his voice sounded genuine. The pain looked real. If I hadn't read Sarah's journal, if I didn't know what he'd done, I might have even believed him. But I had read the journal. I did know. Your Honor, I said, and my voice carried to every corner of that silent street. I'm sorry for your loss. Truly, losing family is devastating. I know. I lost my father in a mining accident when I was 12. I watched my mother bury her husband after Little Bighorn. I paused. But grief doesn't justify theft. Pain doesn't excuse fraud. And love, especially rejected love, doesn't give you the right to destroy someone's life. I pulled Sarah's journal from my bag and held it up. Sarah Brennan McAllister kept a record. She documented your visits to the ranch. She wrote about how you watched the property, measured boundaries, made threats. And she wrote about the day before she died, when you came to the house and told her that Jonas's past was coming back to haunt him. Howell went white. That journal is inadmissible, he said. Hearsay from a dead woman. Then let's talk about living witnesses, I said. Gerald Collier, the surveyor who verified the boundary in 1874. He's ready to testify that you tried to bribe him to falsify his records. Hector Dawes, Jonas's neighbor who witnessed the original 1871 survey, ready to testify. Franklin Pierce, the town doctor who treated Sarah the night she died, ready to testify that you visited that afternoon and she was in extreme distress when you left. I looked at Howell directly. Medical records show that extreme stress can trigger premature labor. You didn't pull a trigger, Judge Howell, but you killed Sarah as surely as if you had. And now you're trying to finish what you started by stealing everything she and Jonas built together. The street erupted, people talking, exclaiming, turning to each other with shocked faces. The careful social order of Copper Creek, fracturing around one simple truth spoken aloud. Warren Howell was not the victim. He was the villain. And then Adelaide Marsh did something I never expected. She stepped forward from the crowd, stood in the middle of Main Street, and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Your Honor, she said, and the title sounded like an accusation. I owe Miss Thornfield an apology. The street went quiet again. When she first came to town, I judged her, for her appearance, her directness. I thought she was improper, unfeminine. I said things designed to make her feel small. Adelaide's voice strengthened. But I've been listening to this exchange, and I realize that Nora Thornfield is what I should have been 20 years ago. She turned to face Howell directly. 20 years ago, you ruled that my inheritance from my father should go to my husband's brother. You said childless women had no need of family estates. You took everything my father built and gave it to a man who drank it away in 5 years. Her voice broke slightly, but she pushed through. I stayed silent then because I was afraid, because challenging a judge seemed impossible, because I'd been taught that women should accept what men in authority decided. She looked at me, at Jonas, at the crowd. But watching Nora stand up to you, seeing her refuse to be intimidated, I'm not afraid anymore. People started moving then, stepping forward, finding their voices. Hector Dawes emerged from the crowd. I'll testify to the 1871 boundary survey, he said. Jonas McAllister is a good neighbor and an honest man. I won't watch him be robbed. Gerald Collier came next, leaning heavily on a cane but standing straight. I'll testify that you tried to bribe me to falsify survey records. I'm dying anyway. Might as well die honest. Dr. Franklin Pierce stepped forward. I'll testify about Sarah McAllister's death, about her condition when I arrived, about your visit that afternoon. One by one, townspeople who'd been silent, who'd watched Howell operate for years, found their courage. Even the young land office clerk stepped forward. I'll testify that Judge Howell requested records and asked me to document discrepancies that don't exist. Warren Howell stood in the middle of Main Street, watching his carefully constructed power crumble. His face went through several emotions: shock, anger, calculation. Then he smiled. It was a terrible smile, cold and sharp. "Very impressive, Miss Thornfield," he said quietly. "You've turned my own town against me. Well played." He adjusted his coat. "But you've made one critical mistake. You've shown your hand too early. You've told me exactly what evidence you have and exactly who your witnesses are." He looked around at the assembled crowd. "And now I know exactly what I need to do to win." He turned and walked away, unhurried, controlled. But I'd seen his face when the crowd turned. I'd seen the rage underneath, and I knew we'd just made ourselves targets. We rode back to the ranch in tense silence. My mother sat between Jonas and me on the wagon bench, her eyes scanning the tree line on either side of the road, looking for threats. She'd lived through enough frontier violence to know that when powerful men got cornered, they struck back. "You poked the bear," she said finally. "I know," I replied. Was it wise? Probably not, but it was necessary. Howell was operating in shadows, counting on people being too afraid to speak up. We brought it into the light. Now we can't pretend this is just routine legal procedure. Jonas spoke for the first time since leaving town. He'll come after us now, directly. "Yes," I said, "which means we need to move faster than he does." "How?" "We go to Helena, tomorrow. We find out who really owns Meridian Land Holdings. We get that documentation to the territorial authorities. We make this bigger than Copper Creek, bigger than one county judge can bury. That's 3 days' ride minimum," Jonas said, "in weather that could turn. And if Howell sends men after us." "Then we take the mountain route," I said, "longer but less predictable, harder to ambush." "You're talking about 5 days through rough terrain," Jonas said. "Maybe more if we hit snow. Do we have a choice?" We looked at each other. The answer was clear in both our faces. We reached the ranch as the sun was setting. The house looked solid and safe in the golden light, smoke rising from the chimney where my mother had banked the fire that morning. It looked like home, like something worth fighting for. Jonas helped us down from the wagon and began unhitching the horses. I went inside to start supper. That's when I smelled it, sweet and acrid at the same time. Wrong. I looked at the coffee pot on the stove. My mother always left coffee warming for when we returned. But this smell was wrong. Chemical. "Don't drink that," I said sharply as my mother reached for a cup. "What?" "Don't drink it. Something's wrong." I grabbed a rag and carefully lifted the coffee pot, brought it to the window where the light was better. The coffee looked normal, smelled almost normal. But that sweet undertone. I'd worked in enough army hospitals to know what arsenic smelled like. Some people couldn't detect it at all, but I'd been trained to recognize poisons, to identify the subtle signs that could mean the difference between life and death for a patient. This coffee had been poisoned. "Jonas," I called, keeping my voice level. "Come inside, carefully." He entered, read my face, and his hand moved instinctively toward the rifle by the door. "Someone's been in the house," I said. "The coffee's been poisoned." We checked every room, nothing obviously disturbed, nothing missing. But someone had definitely been here. The kitchen window, which I'd latched that morning, was unlatched now. And outside, in the soft earth beneath the window, were boot prints, large prints, hobnail pattern, the same prints I'd seen near the cairn. "Clyde Marsh," Jonas said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "He was in our house." My mother examined the boot prints with the practiced eye of someone who'd tracked game and people across half the frontier. "He came in through the window," she said, "went straight to the kitchen, poisoned the coffee, left the same way. Probably watching from the tree line when we left for town. Had hours to work. The dose would have been small," I said, still examining the coffee pot. Enough to make us sick, incapacitate us, maybe kill us depending on how much we drank. This is attempted murder, my mother said flatly. This is war, Jonas corrected. Howls escalating. We confronted him in public. He strikes back in private. I set down the coffee pot carefully. We leave for Helena at first light, I said. Tonight we take shifts keeping watch. Nobody sleeps unguarded. Nora, Jonas started. No arguments. He tried to poison us today. Tomorrow it might be bullets or fire. We're out of time for careful planning. We move now or we don't move at all. That night we organized ourselves like a military operation. Jonas took first watch, rifle across his knees, sitting where he could see both the front door and the kitchen window. My mother took second watch. I took third, the hours before dawn when attacks most often came. During my watch, sitting in the dark with Jonas's rifle heavy in my hands, I thought about Sarah's journal, about the woman who'd been afraid but documented her fear anyway, about the child who'd never been born, never had a chance to be the Nora her mother had dreamed of. And I thought about the coffee pot, about how close we'd come, about how if my training hadn't taught me to recognize that sweet chemical smell, we'd all be dead or dying right now. I heard movement behind me, Jonas emerging from his room. He couldn't sleep either. He sat down beside me without speaking. We watched the darkness together. Finally he said, "When Sarah died, I thought God was punishing me for what I did to Thomas Brennan. For all the people I brought in as a Pinkerton who ended up hanged or imprisoned, I thought I deserved to lose everything I loved." He looked at me. "But watching you stand up to Howell today, watching you refuse to back down even when he threatened and Adelaide Marsh tried to shame you, I realized something." "What?" "Maybe Sarah didn't die as punishment. Maybe she died because sometimes terrible things happen in this world, and maybe the real question isn't why did I lose her? Maybe it's what am I going to do with the life I still have?" "That's good theology," I said quietly. "Is it? Better than spending the rest of your life flagellating yourself for tragedies you couldn't prevent." We sat in silence for a moment. Then Jonas said, "Why are you really doing this? Fighting this hard for a ranch that isn't yours, for a man you barely know?" I thought about how to answer, about all the true things I could say, about Fort Reno, and the soldiers and the corrupt lieutenant colonel, about Edmund Voss and the Grand Hotel and 40 people watching me walk out, about a lifetime of being told I should shrink myself and learning to refuse. But what I said was simpler and more true than all of that. Because I'm tired of watching good people lose to bad people, because the good people think they have to fight alone, because I spent 3 years being silent when I should have spoken up and I'm not doing that anymore, and because I stopped, started again, because you looked at me on that first day and you saw a person, not a problem, not a charity case, not a woman who should be grateful for whatever scraps came her way, just a person who might be able to help. I met his eyes in the darkness. Nobody's looked at me that way in a very long time. Jonas reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to, and took my hand. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm. "I see you, Nora Thornfield," he said. "I see your strength and your brilliance and your absolute refusal to be diminished, and I'm grateful every day that you answered that telegram." We sat there in the darkness, hands linked, watching for enemies that might come at any moment. And for the first time since Abilene, since the Grand Hotel, since Edmund Voss stood up and said I had no business expecting to be seen with a man like him, I felt something shift in my chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it, the space where it might grow if we survived long enough to let it. Dawn came cold and clear. We packed quickly, efficiently. Warm clothes, supplies for 5 days, the documents safely wrapped in oilcloth, Sarah's journal, Collier's survey confirmation, copies of everything we'd gathered. My mother checked our provisions with the thoroughness of someone who'd survived hard travel before. Jonas saddled 3 horses, choosing the strongest and most sure-footed for the mountain route. We were ready to leave when we heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Jonas grabbed his rifle. I moved to put myself between the approaching rider and my mother, which was instinctive and probably foolish, but I'd spent 3 years protecting people, and the habit ran deep. But the rider who came into view was Hector Dawes, Jonas's neighbor, riding hard and pulling up in a spray of dust. "Don't go to Helena," he said without preamble. "Hector," Jonas started, "don't go. I was in town this morning before dawn. Heard Clyde Marsh bragging in the saloon. Said he'd taken care of the big woman, said Howell's got men waiting on the Helena Road. You go that way, you won't come back. The regular route is blocked," I said. "Then we take the mountain pass." "That's 5 days through rough terrain," Dawes said. "Maybe more. And weather's turning. Could hit snow any time." "We don't have a choice," Jonas said. "We need documentation from Helena showing Howell's connection to Meridian. Without that, it's just accusations. With it, we have proof of systematic fraud." Dawes looked at us for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "There's an old trapper's cabin about halfway through the pass. If weather turns bad, you can shelter there. And take this." He handed Jonas a detailed map of the mountain route, hand-drawn, showing water sources and shelter points. "I used to run trap lines through there 30 years ago. Routes haven't changed. Water sources neither." "Thank you, Hector," Jonas said. "Bring back that proof," Dawes said. "End this thing. For Sarah. For all of us." We rode out as the sun cleared the mountains, heading west toward the high passes. The route was immediately harder than the main road. Narrow trails, steep grades, loose rock, terrain where one misstep could mean a fatal fall. But it was also beautiful. Montana in autumn, all gold and crimson against gray stone and green pine. Beauty that made you understand why people fought so hard to stay in this unforgiving country. We rode in silence for the most part, saving energy, watching the trail. But during the brief rest stops, Jonas would point out landmarks. "That peak is Mount Henderson. That valley is where the Crow used to winter, before the army pushed them out. That river feeds into the Missouri eventually." He was sharing his world with me, teaching me the geography of the place he'd chosen to make his stand. By the 3rd day, we were deep in the mountains. The air was thin and cold. Our breath came in visible puffs. The horses moved more slowly, picking their way carefully over increasingly difficult terrain. That's when the weather turned. It started with clouds rolling in from the west, thick and gray and moving fast. Then the temperature dropped sharply. Then the first snowflakes began to fall. Within an hour, it was a full blizzard. "We need shelter," my mother shouted over the wind. "Now!" Jonas consulted Dawes's map, trying to orient himself in the whiteout conditions. "The trapper's cabin should be near," he yelled back. "Half-mile ahead if I'm reading this right." We pushed forward, the snow getting heavier, visibility dropping to almost nothing. The horses were struggling now, fighting through deepening drifts. Then I saw it, a dark shape through the white. The cabin, half buried in snow but still standing. "There," I called, pointing. We made it to the cabin and got the horses into a rough lean to shelter on the side. Then we stumbled inside, snow-covered and shaking with cold. The cabin was small. 1 room, but solid. A stone fireplace, rough bunks, old but intact. Someone, probably Dawes, had left a supply of dry wood stacked against one wall. Jonas got a fire going while my mother and I checked our supplies. Everything had stayed mostly dry. We had food for several more days if we were careful. But the storm outside showed no signs of stopping. "We're stuck here until this passes," Jonas said, looking out the small window at the white chaos beyond. "How long do storms like this usually last?" I asked. "Could be hours, could be days." We settled in to wait. There was nothing else we could do. That night, with the storm howling outside and the fire crackling in the hearth, we sat together and talked. Really talked. Not about Howell or surveys or fraud. About our lives, our stories. The things that made us who we were. Jonas told us about growing up in Ohio, about joining the Pinkertons young because he wanted adventure and purpose, about the gradual realization that the work he was doing wasn't heroic, it was brutal, about the day he quit and headed west with nothing but guilt and determination to build something clean. My mother talked about following my father through cavalry posts, about the strange community of army wives, about watching Little Bighorn from a distance and knowing, somehow knowing, that her husband wasn't coming back. And I talked about being 12 years old and suddenly the largest person in every room, about learning that my size made people uncomfortable and trying to make myself useful enough that they'd overlook it. About 3 years at Fort Reno, learning that competence and morality didn't always protect you from powerful men who wanted you silent. It was the most honest conversation I'd had in years, maybe ever. Sometime past midnight, my mother fell asleep on one of the bunks, wrapped in blankets, snoring softly. Jonas and I sat by the fire, watching the flames, listening to the storm. "Can I ask you something?" Jonas said quietly. "Always." When Edmund Voss said those things to you at the Grand Hotel, when he humiliated you in front of all those people, how did you walk out without breaking? I thought about that night, about the soup tureen in my hands and the 40 faces watching, and the particular quality of silence that comes when cruelty is performed in public. I didn't walk out without breaking, I said. I broke. I shattered. I went back to my room and I cried until I couldn't breathe. Then how did I get up the next morning and keep going? Yes. I looked at the fire, at my hands, at this man who asked real questions and waited for real answers, because I realized that Edmund Voss didn't actually have the power to define me. He could say whatever he wanted, but the truth of who I am, that's not determined by cruel men in hotel dining rooms. It's determined by what I do when I'm alone, by whether I keep my promises, by whether I stand up when standing up costs something. I met Jonas's eyes. Edmund Voss called me too much. And you know what? He was right. I am too much for small-minded people who measure worth by how little space you take up. I am too much for men who want women decorative and grateful and quiet. I smiled. But for this? For fighting corruption and protecting good people and standing in the truth even when it's hard. For this, I'm exactly what's needed. Jonas looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he said quietly, "I'm falling in love with you, Nora Thornfield." My breath caught. "I know it's too soon," he continued. "I know we barely know each other. I know we're in the middle of a fight for my ranch and possibly our lives. But I need you to know. Because if something happens, if Howell's men find us or we don't make it through this, I need you to know that you changed everything for me." He reached out and touched my face, gentle, asking permission. "You walked into my life when I'd given up on everything except survival. And you showed me that there are still people worth fighting for, still things worth building, still reasons to hope. I should have pulled away, should have said it was too soon, too complicated, too dangerous to let feelings develop in the middle of a crisis. But I'd spent 28 years being careful, being practical, protecting myself from exactly this kind of vulnerability, and I was tired of it. I leaned forward and kissed Jonas McAllister in a trapper's cabin in the Montana mountains while a blizzard raged outside. His arms came around me, strong and sure, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself be held. We broke apart eventually, both breathing hard, both understanding that this changed everything and nothing. The fight with Howell was still waiting. The danger was still real. But now we had something worth fighting for beyond property and principle. We had each other. The storm blew itself out by morning. I woke weak and shaking, the poison still working through my system, though 2 days had passed since I'd nearly drunk that coffee. My mother made me drink water until I thought I'd burst, checking my pulse every hour with the focused attention of someone who'd seen arsenic poisoning before. "You're not riding today," she said firmly when I tried to stand. "We don't have time to. You barely have strength to walk. You'll ride when you can stay upright." Jonas kept watch, rifle ready, expecting Howell's men to find us. But the mountains stayed quiet, the storm having covered our tracks. We lost another day to my recovery. I hated the delay, hated my body's weakness, hated that Howell's poison was still slowing us down. But my mother was right. I could barely walk to the door without my vision blurring. By the 3rd morning after the poisoning, I could mount a horse without swaying. It would have to be enough. We emerged from the cabin to find the world transformed, everything white and clean and new, the sky painfully blue, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. We had lost 3 days total to storm and sickness, which meant we had less time in Helena, less margin for error. We rode hard the rest of the way, pushing the horses as much as we dared on the treacherous snow-covered trails. And finally, on the afternoon of the 8th day since leaving the ranch, Helena came into view in the valley below, the territorial capital, where the records we needed waited, where the truth about Warren Howell and Meridian landholdings was documented in official files, where we would find the weapon we needed to end this fight, or where we would discover we'd come all this way for nothing. Jonas looked at me as we started down the final descent into Helena. "Whatever we find," he said, "we face it together." Together, I agreed, and we rode into Helena to claim our proof. Helena spread out below us like a promise, bigger than Copper Creek by considerable margin, full of the particular energy that comes with being a territorial capital. Buildings of real substance lined the streets. The gleam of glass windows caught the afternoon sun. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys into the cold blue sky. Somewhere in that maze of streets and structures was the Territorial Land Office, and in that office were records that would either save Jonas McAllister's ranch or prove we'd risked everything for nothing. We found a boarding house on the edge of town, run by a practical woman named Mrs. Gunderson, who took one look at our snow-covered clothes and trail-worn faces and asked no questions beyond how many nights and how many meals. Frontier hospitality that understood sometimes people needed shelter without interrogation. My mother went to secure our rooms. Jonas and I headed straight for the land office. It was a substantial building, brick and timber, with the solid permanence of territorial authority. Inside, clerks moved between filing cabinets with bureaucratic efficiency. The air smelled of paper and ink and the particular mustiness of old documents. A middle-aged man looked up from his desk as we entered. His nameplate read, "Edmund Fraser, Director of Survey Records." "Help you?" he asked, not unfriendly but clearly busy. "I need to see the incorporation documents for Meridian Land Holdings," I said, "filed out of Helena, probably within the last 10 years. Fraser's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a specific request." "You have authorization?" I pulled out the papers Jonas had signed, authorizing me to research matters related to his property dispute. Fraser read them carefully, then looked at me with sharper attention. "You're the housekeeper from Copper Creek," he said. "Word travels." "Word travels," I agreed, "especially when a county judge tries to steal land through fraudulent surveys." Fraser's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Thornfield," I supplied. "Nora Thornfield. And yes, it's serious. Which is why I need to see who actually owns Meridian Land Holdings." Fraser stood slowly, walked to a filing cabinet, pulled out a folder, but instead of handing it to me, he sat back down and opened it himself. "I've been director of this office for 8 years, he said quietly. "In that time, I've watched 7 properties in Copper Creek County change hands under questionable circumstances, always the same pattern. Boundary dispute, survey ordered by Judge Howell, property owner forced into expensive legal battle, foreclosure, auction. Meridian Land Holdings buys at fraction of value." He looked up at me. "My brother was number 3, lost his ranch 4 years ago, died 6 months later. Broken heart, the doctor said. But I knew better. Died of injustice. Died knowing he'd been robbed and couldn't prove it." Fraser opened the folder fully. "I've suspected Howell for years, but suspicion isn't proof, and judges are hard to touch, especially when they're careful about covering their tracks." He slid the folder across to me. "But if you've got evidence that connects him directly to Meridian, if you can prove systematic fraud, then maybe we can finally stop him." I opened the folder. Read carefully, and there it was, buried in the secondary filing documents that most people never bothered to check. The beneficial ownership disclosure, required by territorial law but rarely examined. Meridian Land Holdings, Incorporated. Registered agent, Cartwright and Associates, Helena. Beneficial owner, Warren T. Howell, Copper Creek. Filed March 1873. 5 years before he'd ordered the survey on Jonas's property. 5 years of planning, of building, of systematically stealing land while hiding behind judicial authority. I looked up at Fraser. This is it. This is what we need. It's a start, Fraser said, but you need more than incorporation documents. You need to show pattern. Show that Howell used his position as judge to benefit his own company. He pulled out another folder. These are the court records for the 7 properties Meridian acquired. I've been keeping copies. Dates of survey orders, dates of court rulings, dates of foreclosure sales, all signed by Judge Howell. He spread them out on the desk. You put these together with the Meridian ownership documents. You've got a case for systematic judicial corruption and fraud. Why are you helping us? Jonas asked, speaking for the first time. Fraser looked at him directly. Because my brother built his ranch with his own hands over 15 years, because he was a good man who played by the rules and got destroyed by someone who didn't, because I'm tired of watching corrupt men win while good men lose everything. He stood. And because someone needs to stand up to Warren Howell. Might as well be us. We spent 3 hours in that office, copying documents, cross-referencing dates, building the case with the methodical precision of people who knew they'd only get one chance at this. When we finally emerged, the sun was setting, and my hands were cramped from writing. But we had what we needed, documentation showing Howell owned Meridian. Court records showing he'd ruled in cases where his own company stood to benefit, a pattern so clear that even territorial authorities couldn't ignore it. Back at the boarding house, we spread everything out on the table in our room. My mother studied the documents with the careful attention she brought to everything. This is strong, she said finally, but you still have a problem. What problem? Jonas asked. Howell is a sitting judge, she said. Arresting him, removing him from the bench, that requires territorial authority. Fraser can document the fraud, but he can't act on it. You need someone with law enforcement power. She looked at me. You need a federal marshal. The next morning, we went to the U.S. Marshal's office. It was housed in a building shared with other territorial offices, marked only by a simple brass plaque. Inside, a man sat at a desk reviewing wanted posters. He was maybe 50, weathered, with the particular alertness of someone who'd spent years dealing with dangerous people. His badge read, Marshal Benjamin Hayes. Marshal Hayes, I said. We need to report systematic judicial corruption in Copper Creek County. Hayes looked up, studied us for a long moment, then gestured to the chairs. I'm listening. I laid it out for him, everything. The 7 properties, the pattern of fraudulent surveys, Howell's ownership of Meridian, the court records showing he'd ruled in cases benefiting his own company, Sarah's journal documenting his threats, the attempted poisoning. Hayes listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat back in his chair. That's comprehensive, he said, but Howell is a sitting judge. I can't just arrest him on your word, even with documentation. Then what can you do? Jonas asked, frustration breaking through. Hayes pulled out a map of Montana Territory, marked Copper Creek with his finger. I can ride to Copper Creek, today, with federal authority. I can investigate these claims, interview witnesses, examine the properties in question. He looked at Jonas. And if everything you've told me checks out, I can arrest Judge Warren Howell for judicial corruption, fraud, conspiracy, and if we can prove it, accessory to murder. When can you leave? I asked. Within the hour, Hayes said. But I need you to understand something. The moment I start asking questions in Copper Creek, Howell will know, and if he's as dangerous as you say, he'll act. Fast. We're ready, Jonas said. Are you? Hayes looked at him directly. Because going back to Copper Creek means walking into a fight. Howell won't go quietly. He's got men. He's got resources. He's got everything to lose. Then we'd better make sure he loses it, I said. Hayes studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right then, let's go end this. We rode out of Helena within 2 hours, Marshal Hayes and 2 of his deputies accompanying us. The return journey took 3 days, pushing hard, stopping only when the horses needed rest. 3 days of watching the horizon. 3 days of knowing that every mile brought us closer to confrontation. 3 days of Jonas and I stealing moments together when we could, holding hands in the darkness, speaking quietly about what came after, if there was an after. On the 3rd day, we saw smoke rising in the distance. Too much smoke for cooking fires, too dark for hearth fires. Something was burning. We pushed the horses into a gallop, racing toward Copper Creek, fear rising in my throat. Please not the ranch, I thought. Please not everything Jonas built. But as we came over the final rise, I saw it wasn't the ranch burning. It was the town. Not the whole town, just one building. The land office. Flames consumed it completely, sending black smoke into the afternoon sky. Townspeople had formed a bucket brigade, trying to save the surrounding structures, but the land office itself was already lost. Jonas and I rode straight to the crowd, found the young land office clerk, his face smudged with soot, staring at the destruction. "What happened?" I demanded. "Fire started this morning," he said numbly. "Don't know how, but all the records are gone. Every survey document, every land filing, everything." "Not everything," I said. "I have copies." The clerk's head snapped toward me. "You do?" "Every document related to Jonas's property, including the original 1871 survey by Pruitt." Relief flooded his face, then fear. "Miss Thornfield, you need to be careful. This wasn't an accident. Someone set this fire, and the only person who benefits from destroying land records is—" "Judge Howell," Marshal Hayes finished, stepping forward. He showed his badge. "Federal Marshal, and I'm here to investigate Judge Warren Howell for systematic fraud and corruption." The crowd that had gathered around the burning building suddenly got very quiet. All eyes turned to Hayes. "Where is Judge Howell?" Hayes asked. "At the courthouse," someone said. "He's been there all morning, said he had important business to attend to." Hayes looked at his deputies. "Let's go have a conversation with the judge." But that night, something remarkable happened. Adelaide Marsh knocked on our door at the boarding house. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood a dozen townspeople, gathering in the lamplight like conspirators. "We've been talking," Adelaide said without preamble, "about what you said in the street, about standing up, about not being afraid anymore." Gerald Collier stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane. "I'm dying anyway. Might as well die useful. And I'm tired of watching good men lose," Hector Dawes added. One by one, they pledged to testify, to stand witness, to end their silence. I looked at them, these ordinary people finding extraordinary courage, and understood. This was never about me saving Jonas's ranch. This was about a community deciding they'd had enough. I'd just been the spark that lit the kindling. "Tomorrow," Adelaide said. "We'll all go to the courthouse tomorrow. Together." We found Warren Howell in his courthouse chambers the next morning, sitting at his desk, as if he hadn't a care in the world. He looked up when we entered, and his face showed only mild surprise. "Marshal Hayes," he said pleasantly. "To what do I owe the honor?" "Judge Warren Howell," Hayes said formally. "I'm here to investigate allegations of judicial corruption, fraud, and conspiracy." Howell's expression didn't change. "Based on what evidence?" "Based on this," I said, stepping forward. I placed the stack of copied documents on his desk. Incorporation records showing you own Meridian land holdings, court records showing you ruled in cases where your company stood to benefit, survey orders you issued that directly benefited your business interests. I pulled out Sarah's journal. "And testimony from your late niece, documenting your threats against her husband." Howell looked at the documents, then at me. Then he smiled. "That journal is inadmissible hearsay," he said calmly. "The incorporation documents prove nothing illegal, and as a county judge, I have every right to own property and business interests, not when those interests create direct conflicts with your judicial duties," Hayes said. "Not when you use your position to benefit yourself financially." "Prove it," Howell said. His confidence was absolute. Prove that I ordered surveys specifically to benefit Meridian. Prove that I knew the outcomes before I ruled. You can't. Because I was careful. He stood. I'm a respected judge in this territory. You're making accusations based on the word of a housekeeper and a failed Pinkerton. Do you really think territorial authorities will believe you over me? They'll believe the witnesses, I said. What witnesses? Howell asked. Gerald Collier? He's dying. His testimony will be dismissed as the ramblings of a sick old man. Hector Dawes, a neighbor with obvious bias. Dr. Pierce? He can't prove what I said to Sarah the day before she died. He looked at me directly. You've got nothing that will stand up in a territorial court, and you know it. Then Adelaide Marsh walked into the courthouse. She wasn't alone. Behind her came Gerald Collier, leaning on his cane but standing straight. Hector Dawes, Dr. Franklin Pierce, the land office clerk, Gerald Fitch, the notary, and behind them, dozens of townspeople, filling the courthouse, standing witness. Adelaide stepped forward. Your Honor, she said, and the title was pure acid. I'm here to testify that 20 years ago, you stole my inheritance, using fraudulent legal rulings. I stayed silent then because I was afraid. I'm not afraid anymore. Collier spoke next. I'm here to testify that you attempted to bribe me to falsify survey records. I have documentation. Dawes stepped forward. I'm here to testify about the original 1871 boundary survey, and about how your men burned my barn to intimidate me. One by one, they spoke. Pierce about Sarah's death, the clerk about being asked to falsify records, Fitch about notarizing documents he later realized were fraudulent, and then others, people Howell had wronged over the years, people who'd been too afraid to speak up. Until now. Howell's face changed as he listened, the confident mask cracking, the careful control fracturing. This is a conspiracy, he said, his voice rising. You've all been turned against me by this woman, this outsider who knows nothing about our town. I know plenty about your town, I said quietly. I know it's full of good people who've been intimidated into silence. People who've watched you abuse your power for years. People who are tired of being afraid. I stepped closer to his desk. I'm 6 feet tall, and I've spent my whole life refusing to shrink for men like you. Men who think authority means they can crush anyone who won't bow. But I don't bow, Judge Howell. I never have. I held up the documents. You tried to poison me. You burned the land office to destroy evidence. You threatened a dying man and a pregnant woman. You've stolen land and ruined lives, and hidden behind your authority. I smiled. But you made one mistake. You assumed no one would fight back. You assumed fear would keep everyone silent forever. The courthouse was absolutely silent. Marshal Hayes, I said, keeping my eyes on Howell. Do you have enough to arrest him? Hayes looked at the crowd of witnesses, at the documents, at Howell's face. Judge Warren Howell, he said formally, you're under arrest for judicial corruption, fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and attempted murder. Howell went for the gun in his desk drawer. Jonas was faster. He grabbed Howell's wrist, twisted, disarmed him with the smooth efficiency of 4 years of Pinkerton training. Hayes's deputies moved in, snapping handcuffs on Howell's wrists, and Warren Howell, who'd spent years being untouchable, who'd believed his position made him immune to justice, was led out of his own courthouse in chains. The crowd parted silently to let them through. As Howell passed me, he looked directly into my eyes. This isn't over, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. It is. The next morning, Marshal Hayes came to the ranch. He was accompanied by a territorial official I didn't recognize. Miss Thornfield, Mr. McAllister, the official said. I'm here on behalf of the territorial governor. We've reviewed the evidence you provided. Judge Howell has been formally removed from the bench pending trial. The survey order on your property has been voided, and the foreclosure notice has been rescinded. He handed Jonas a document. Your ranch is yours, Mr. McAllister, free and clear. Jonas took the paper with hands that shook slightly, stared at it like he couldn't quite believe what he was reading. There's more, Hayes added. We've opened investigations into all 7 properties Meridian Land Holdings acquired. Preliminary review suggests they were all obtained through fraudulent means. The properties will be returned to their original owners or their heirs. He looked at me. The territorial governor would like to offer you a position, Miss Thornfield. Investigator for land fraud cases across Montana Territory. We need people who can read documents the way you do, who can see patterns others miss. It was everything I'd worked for. Recognition, authority, the chance to fight corruption on a larger scale. I looked at Jonas, at the ranch around us, at the life we'd been building in the spaces between fighting for survival. I appreciate the offer, Marshal, I said, but I have a position already. Housekeeper at the McAllister Ranch. I smiled. Of course, the job description might be changing soon. Jonas looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Hope and question and something deeper. Miss Thornfield, he said formally, may I speak with you privately? We walked away from the house, out toward the east boundary, where the cottonwood tree stood ancient and unmoved. The stone cairn sat solid beside it, white quartz glinting in morning sun. Nora, Jonas said, and stopped, started again. I'm not good with words. I'm better with my hands, with building things, with making things work. But I need to say this, and I need to say it right. He took both my hands in his. You saved my ranch. You saved my life. You saved me. You walked into this fight when you could have walked away, and you stood beside me when standing was the hardest thing either of us could do. He dropped to one knee in the grass, still holding my hands. I love you, Nora Agnes Thornfield. I love your strength, your refusal to diminish yourself for anyone, and how perfectly you fit this wild, unforgiving territory. I love that you're exactly what this hard country needs, and exactly who I want beside me for the rest of my life. He pulled a ring from his pocket. Simple gold, sturdy, practical. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life standing beside you, building something good together? I looked at Jonas McAllister, this mountain of a man kneeling in the grass, offering me everything. I thought about Edmund Voss and the Grand Hotel and 40 people watching me walk out. I thought about Fort Reno and corruption and the price of speaking truth. I thought about Sarah's journal and the woman who'd wanted to name her daughter Nora, and I thought about the life I could build here, not as a housekeeper, not as someone grateful for scraps, but as a partner, as someone who belonged because she chose to, not because she had nowhere else to go. Yes, I said. Yes, I'll marry you. Jonas stood and pulled me into his arms and kissed me in front of God and Montana and the cottonwood tree that had stood witness to 7 years of building and 1 year of fighting and this moment of choosing forever. We were married 3 weeks later in the church at Copper Creek. The whole town came. Adelaide Marsh cried through the entire ceremony. Gerald Collier was there, weaker but determined to see it. Hector Dawes stood as witness. Dr. Pierce signed the marriage certificate. Even Marshal Hayes came, taking a break from his investigation to see justice of a different kind done. I wore a simple dress that my mother and Adelaide had made together, working side by side at Adelaide's sewing table, building an unexpected friendship through thread and fabric and shared recognition of wasted years. Jonas wore his best suit, looking uncomfortable and magnificent. And when Reverend Matthews said we could kiss, Jonas lifted me clear off my feet, which made the congregation laugh and my mother cry, and Adelaide declare it the most romantic thing she'd ever seen. We spent our wedding night at the ranch, in the house Jonas had built with his hands, now ours together. And sometime in the dark hours before dawn, lying in Jonas's arms, I thought about the journey that had brought me here, about telegrams and train rides and Montana roads, about Sarah's journal and Howell's corruption, and the fight we'd won. But mostly I thought about belonging, about finding a place that fit, about discovering that I wasn't too much or too little, but exactly enough for the life I'd chosen and the man who'd chosen me back. You're thinking loud, Jonas murmured against my hair. Just thinking about how I ended up here, I said. Regrets? Not a single one. He pulled me closer. Good. Because you're stuck with me now, Nora McAllister. Nora McAllister, I repeated, testing the name. I like how that sounds. So do I. We lay in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Jonas said, I was thinking we should expand the house. Add another room. Maybe 2. Why? He put his hand on my stomach, gentle, hopeful, just in case we need the space. I covered his hand with mine and smiled in the darkness. Just in case, I agreed. Spring came to Montana with the particular violence of mountain weather, all mud and melt and new grass pushing up through last year's death. By the time the cottonwood leafed out again, I was visibly pregnant. Jonas fussed over me like I was made of glass, which I found both touching and ridiculous. I was still doing the accounts, still managing the household, still riding into town for supplies despite his protests. I'm pregnant, I told him, not dying. But he'd lost Sarah and their child. The fear lived in him, quiet but permanent. So I let him fuss, let him worry, let him build the extra rooms with meticulous care, making sure everything was perfect for the child who would come in autumn. Gerald Collier died in June, peaceful in his sleep, having lived long enough to see Howell convicted and the land returned to its rightful owners. The whole town came to his funeral. Marshal Hayes gave a eulogy that made grown men cry. After the service, Hayes pulled me aside. Collier left you something, he said. Asked me to give it to you after he passed. He handed me a leather-bound book. New, expensive. I opened it. Inside, Collier had written in his careful surveyor's hand, for Nora McAllister, the woman who taught an old man that it's never too late to stand up. May you fill this with your own truths, your own fights, your own victories. You changed this territory for the better. Don't stop now. With respect and admiration, Gerald Collier. The rest of the pages were blank, waiting. I looked at Hayes. Did he really think I changed the territory? Hayes smiled. Miss Thornfield, you took down a corrupt judge, exposed systematic fraud, and inspired half of Copper Creek to find their courage. I'd say you changed more than the territory. You changed people's understanding of what's possible. He tipped his hat. Keep fighting the good fight. We need more people like you. In September, Warren Howell was sentenced to 12 years in territorial prison. His assets, including all properties held by Meridian Land Holdings, were seized and redistributed to the people he'd stolen from. Clyde Marsh and his brothers were arrested the same day as Howell. Arson, attempted murder, witness intimidation. Marshal Hayes took particular satisfaction in that arrest. The 3 of them were sentenced to 8 years hard labor, rebuilding the structures they'd burned, including Jonas's barn. Jonas said watching Clyde Marsh sweat under the Montana sun, building back what he'd destroyed, was justice of the most satisfying kind. Jonas and I attended Howell's sentencing. Howell looked at us across the courtroom, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something other than arrogance in his face. I saw defeat. Real, final defeat. As he was led away, he stopped and looked back at me. You were right, he said quietly. I did kill Sarah, not with my hands, but with my cruelty, with my need for revenge. He paused. I hope you and McAllister do better than Sarah and I did. I hope you build something that lasts. Then he was gone, and I never saw him again. Our daughter was born on October 12th, exactly 1 year after I'd arrived at the ranch. She came into the world screaming, healthy and strong, with her father's dark hair and her mother's size. We named her Sarah Nora McAllister. Sarah, for the woman who'd fought to protect what she loved. Nora, for the grandmother who'd stood up to land grabbers. And when I held her for the first time, this perfect, impossible gift, I thought about the journey that had brought me here, about all the roads that had seemed like running, but turned out to be arriving. Jonas sat beside me on the bed, his hand on my shoulder, looking at our daughter with wonder. She's beautiful, he whispered. She's perfect, I agreed. My mother stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, smiling wider than I'd seen her smile since my father died. And outside, Montana autumn burned gold and red against blue sky. The cottonwood stood where it had always stood. The cairn marked the boundary. The ranch stretched solid and real across land that was ours, earned through fight and faith and the refusal to back down. 3 months after Sarah Nora was born, a letter arrived from the territorial governor. The investigation into Howell's corruption had expanded. 23 properties across 4 counties, all stolen through the same method, all being returned. And they wanted my help, wanted me to train investigators, to teach them how to read documents the way I did, how to see patterns. I wrote back with my answer, yes, but on my terms. I'd work from home. I'd bring my daughter, and I wouldn't travel more than 1 week per month. They agreed. So I became what I'd never imagined, a mother, a wife, a rancher, and the woman who taught Montana Territory how to fight land fraud. I'd come to Montana running from humiliation. I'd found purpose. I'd found love. I'd found home. And holding my daughter, looking at my husband, feeling my mother's joy fill the room, I understood something fundamental. I wasn't too much. I had never been too much. I was exactly what this hard, beautiful territory needed. I was exactly what this moment required. I was exactly enough. And I was finally, truly, completely home. The end.